Iran has been engaged in war against Israel and America for years. Tried to kill my friend in New York, Masih Alinejad, hired hitmen to try to assassinate my friend. They hired hitmen to try to assassinate President Trump and other U.S. officials.
What role is the UN playing here? What are you seeing right now?
I would say disgraceful reaction by the UN to what's going on, condemning the U.S. and Israel for trying to help the protesters. The UN is aggressively spreading this propaganda. I said never in the history of the UN have we seen such a betrayal.
In the UN right now, what's going on with the Iranian officials? Is it business as usual? Are they still sitting in the same chairs, doing the same jobs?
No, it's business as usual. They're being invited and participating in all the same UN debates.
Can you talk a little bit about the build-up, how we got to this deplorable situation with the UN?
So the bottom line is it's a system where there's no accountability, which is very rare in the world.
That brings to mind your famous video from 2017.
Once upon a time, the Middle East was full of Jews. Algeria had 140,000 Jews. Algeria, where are your Jews? Egypt used to have 75,000 Jews. Where are your Jews? Syria, you had tens of thousands of Jews. Where are your Jews? Iraq, you had over 135,000 Jews. Where are your Jews? Mr. President, where is the real apartheid?
How does the UN tolerate you?
We know that from internal correspondence where they were fantasizing about how they could have me arrested.
Trump's new Board of Peace. Do you think that is a nascent rival to the United Nations?
And the Board of Peace does present a threat to the UN because it actually could be an international body that will get things done.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on The Brink. I'm Andrew Fox.
And I'm Jake Wallace-Simons. Our guest this week is the international lawyer, human rights advocate, and executive director of UN Watch, Hillel Neuer.
Based in Geneva, Hillel has spent 2 decades challenging the conduct of the United Nations and holding authoritarian regimes to account within the UN system. Under his leadership, UN Watch has become one of the most prominent watchdog organisations scrutinising the UN Human Rights Council and exposing abuses by regimes ranging from Iran and Syria to Russia and Venezuela.
Hillel is also widely known for his confrontational speeches at the United Nations, where he's repeatedly lambasted representatives of regimes accused of severe human rights violations. His interventions on Iran's repression, anti-Semitism in international institutions, and the politicization of human rights bodies have made him one of the most visible critics of the UN from inside its own chambers.
With war raging in Iran, Hillel's work is more relevant than ever. And if you're enjoying our podcast, please don't forget to like, subscribe, share it, and leave a comment. We'd love to know what you think. And if you're listening on audio, please give us 5 stars. And if you're still hitting that abominable paywall, now would be a great time to subscribe.
That's right. Paid subscribers also get exclusive access to a live question and answer session with Andrew and myself on Substack every month. For the price of a coffee a month, you can become part of March's conversation, which, given the news, promises to be a good one. Sign up now at thebrinkpodcast.substack.com.
And now, without further ado, we present Hillel Neuer on The Brink. Okay, so Hillel, welcome to The Brink. What we'd like to start is talking about today. Obviously, with the war in Iran ongoing. We'd be really interested if you could let us know, what role is the UN playing here? What's the mood music that's coming out of the UN? How are the Iranians playing this in the UN? Are they still having a visible presence with their domestic regime getting taken apart? What are you seeing right now?
Well, I'm seeing, I would say, a disgraceful reaction by the UN to what's going on. Let's keep in mind that since mass protests began in the end of December, several months ago, the UN was mostly silent, mostly indifferent to protesters being gunned down to the tune of tens of thousands in just 2 days. There were muted responses, took maybe weeks for Secretary General and others to say anything. And even then, these were rather muted responses and basically did nothing to stop a massacre of protesters. This same body this week has sprung into action, immediately condemning the US and Israel for answering the call of the protesters. It's the millions of protesters, the Iranian people, who said, save us. They said, you know, the way that the Jews said, went to Roosevelt, said, bomb the tracks of Auschwitz. They went to Churchill, do anything you can to stop the mass murder. That's what Iranians told me. Do anything you can to stop the mass murder. We need you to stop the murderers. And no one's going to stop it other than military action. And when the military action finally came, the UN, which did nothing to help them, is condemning the help that the Iranians asked for. And when I say condemning, it's been very intense from the UN, numerous accounts from the UN Secretary General, from various UN bodies. Paradoxically, I just tweeted today, the one UN body that is mandated to investigate abuses of Iran against protesters, it's a fact-finding mission that was created here in Geneva at the Human Rights Council in 2022, was given a new mandate after the latest massacre of protesters to investigate Iranian authorities' bloody crackdown on protesters. That body just issued a statement condemning the U.S. and Israel for trying to help the protesters, what they call, you know, violations of international law. So it's quite disgraceful. It's really, I said, never in the history of the UN have we seen such a betrayal and contempt shown for the UN's own founding values.
And what do you think is sparking this? Is it simply off the back of 2 years of anti-Israel hysteria, that literally anything Israel does kinetically is going to be condemned automatically? Is it because the Iranians have more influence than you would expect in the broader UN? What do you think is the reason for this huge gulf between the actual massacre they haven't condemned and then the war that they have?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure that I have the answer. I would agree that the disgraceful approach of the UN is something that we did certainly begin to see in its extreme form since October 7th, where barely weeks after the massacre, Guterres came before the UN and said, yes, I condemn the Hamas attacks, but he said it's also important to note that these attacks did not happen in a vacuum. And he went on to enumerate numerous alleged Palestinian grievances, in effect justifying and legitimizing the massacre by Hamas. And that line was, you know, set the tone for the UN's approach for well over 2 years, which really basically taking the side of Hamas in effect and spreading propaganda. You know, whenever a hospital or a school, say a hospital, would be somehow involved in a conflict, typically because Hamas was based there and Israel was trying to get Hamas out of the hospital, the UN would in their passive aggressive, trying to be clever way, do hashtags like not a target. Hospitals are not a target. They did it this week. They said a school is not a target. Well, of course it wasn't a target. Even if it was an American missile or attack that hit tragically a school, and we don't have all the facts, but let's assume that everything Iran is claiming is true, that a girls' school was hit, perhaps by an American missile. Israel apparently was not operating in that area. The U.S. may have been. Assume that it's all true. Now, given that the U.S. itself launched well over 2,000 attacks, 2,000 strikes, and tragically in war, accidents happen. By definition, they happen in every war. And every innocent death is tragic. So if innocent people were killed, if the reports coming out of the Iranian media, state media, are true, it's tragic. But actually, the facts show the opposite of a war crime. A war crime is intent or recklessness. And if you have 2,000 attacks and 1 out of 2,000 went wrong because apparently the school was either on used to be on a base and is next to an IRGC base, then that doesn't show intent to hit a school. That doesn't show recklessness. It shows the opposite. It shows extraordinary attempts to discriminate between military and non-military targets, between combatants and non-combatants, and mistakes happen. But the UN has been promoting very aggressively, and to be fair, it's not only the UN. There have been Democrats in America, and I assume also in Europe and the UK, who've been focusing on this school, which again, if the reports are true, it's one incident out of thousands where obviously they're aiming to get the regime. So the UN is aggressively spreading this propaganda, coming out not only of UN accounts, but even the few UN mechanisms that are supposed to be for Iran. This fact-finding mission, as well as there's a special rapporteur. Her name is Mai Sato. She's a Japanese professor, teaches in England actually somewhere. She's the special rapporteur on Iran. Again, she's supposed to speak out for the human rights in Iran, and she's condemning the U.S. and Israel. So it seems to be a coordinated attempt, even by mechanisms that are supposedly independent and are supposedly the few that should be helping the people of Iran. They're joining the chorus in condemning the U.S. and Israel.
Yeah, I mean, as an illustration of how things go wrong in war, we saw 3 American planes shot down by friendly fire over Kuwait. So if that can happen, then you can understand that the school could fall into the same category. I mean, am I right in saying that the UN Security Council has still not unequivocally condemned October the 7th?
Yes, I think that's fair to say. I think that's tragically that's fair to say, and that's because, in part, because of Russia and China having the veto and blocking any sort of accurate, morally principled statement.
I mean, how can such a body continue to pose as if it has moral authority, and why is it taken seriously, even though there's this obvious, blatant, and open bias?
Well, I think it's a good question. The bias that we're describing today is shocking. It's blatant. It's contrary to the UN's own values. The UN was founded on the great principles of liberal internationalism with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his wife Eleanor Roosevelt, who helped champion the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so these were great principles the UN was founded upon, and also with the moral clarity being founded by the victors of World War II, the anti-Hitler, the anti-Nazi alliance. Sadly, things got hijacked over the decades. Dictatorships predominate at UN bodies. Sadly, many of them get elected, including Iran. I've been documenting in the past few weeks alone, past 2-3 weeks alone, the Islamic regime in Iran got elected vice chair to 2 different bodies, took a seat on the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee, their deputy foreign minister being invited to speak at the Human Rights Council. The UN is betraying its values. And the question is, why don't people in Europe, many people in Canada and America, Australia, don't seem to see the basic facts? I'll be honest with you. I think in many cases, it's a very sharp political bias, relates to worldview. People whose worldview is anti-American, is anti-Israel, is anti-Jewish. It's a very powerful worldview. They say all the problems in the world is because of the West, because of capitalism, because of Israel, maybe because of the Jews. And they see the UN as a bulwark against the strength of the US. The US is the greatest superpower in the world. And who's going to stop the US? Well, we need the UN. So it's not really because they believe in the UN. Actually, when the UN does things they don't like, they'll condemn it right away. Francesca Albanese, who's a UN rapporteur, she and her colleagues have been condemning the Security Council, accusing the Security Council of acting illegally because they endorsed Trump's proposals for Gaza, the Board of Peace, and so forth. So if the moment that there's a UN decision they don't like, they'll condemn the UN. But in general, it's true that the General Assembly and many UN bodies routinely oppose the US and condemn Israel. And so I don't think it's really something that they really care about the UN per se. It's because they know that dictatorships dominate there, and that seems to be fine for them.
Just to pick up on one element of Andrew's initial question that I just wanted to get you to elaborate on. In the UN right now, what's going on with the Iranian officials? Is it business as usual? Are they still sitting in the same chairs, doing the same jobs,
Yes.
being treated in the same ways, in the same cafes? Business as usual. No one's worrying about that at all.
No, it's business as usual. They're being invited and participating in all the same UN debates. The things that are different are, there's a session now going on of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and for a change, you have countries like Bahrain, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar condemning Iran for aggression. So that's something you didn't normally see before. It's rare to see these countries condemning Iran. Even some of them were opposed. Qatar, more complicated, has a close relationship with Iran in many ways. And suddenly to see them condemning Iran is kind of interesting.
When we look at all these countries that are using the UN as a kind of counterpoint to the US, as you described, is it actually effective? I mean, it doesn't seem to be, from my perspective. Is it constraining the US in any way? Is it realigning sort of that global dynamic at all? Or is it just a talking shop that actually doesn't matter?
Well, it has a certain power. It has a certain force. Certainly around the world, many regard the UN as a voice of international legitimacy, so it affects world opinion. And many countries can hide behind a UN decision saying, we're just aligning with the UN decision. So So when UN statements are made, it can rally many countries around that position. It also enables Europeans and many in the West. In European Parliament, it's very common to say, if someone horrible is invited, let's say Francesca Albanese, who's supported Hamas and who's currently supporting the Islamic regime in Iran, she gets invited to a parliament and someone says, why are you inviting such a horrible person who's been condemned for anti-Semitism, for Holocaust inversion? And then the Dutch parliamentarian or whoever it is will say, no, but it's the United Nations. It's the United Nations. The Netherlands supports the United Nations. We support international law. How could you be against the United Nations? So the moment that the UN is misused to endorse horrible policies, others, including European leaders, can say we stand by the United Nations. So it can be an element, on its own. The UN General Assembly has no power to stop the U.S. Marines and Tomahawk missiles, but they can help those who are trying to build alliances. And of course, even as strong as the U.S. is, if pressure mounts from all over the world, it has an effect.
And let's just focus a little bit on the question of the legality of this war or the illegality of this war. To what extent is it possible to say that the UN is a neutral legal arbiter of belligerents of this sort? And to what extent is it a corrupted system that should be disregarded?
Well, look, let's be honest. If we take the approach of Canada and I presume many EU countries, that you need the Security Council to sign off. Let's break that down. Who's sitting on the Security Council? The United States, England, the UK, France, Russia, and China. Even assuming that France and the UK are on board, okay, and that's an assumption that's not obvious these days. But let's assume they wouldn't veto a proposed U.S. action. Let's assume. Russia and China are going to veto it. And China is buying much of its oil from Iran at discount prices. Russia is a military ally of Iran. They're using their drones to kill people in Ukraine. So if your position, you stand before the Canadian Parliament like the Prime Minister Carney does, my Prime Minister, and he says, oh, well, you must get Security Council approval, that's a recipe for inaction. It's inaction when tens of thousands of people are murdered in 2 days. When Churchill did the morally courageous act of going to war with Hitler, luckily he didn't have to go to the Security Council, because if there were a Security Council and if there were a China and a Russia, they would say absolutely not. So it didn't. The reason you could have that war is because they did the right thing. And the same thing when America joined the war, they didn't have to ask a Security Council. So and to be honest, when Milosevic was killing innocent people in the former Yugoslavia, had America said, well, we need Security Council approval, we won't do it, could have been hundreds of thousands of Kosovars might have been massacred, but America intervened, did not get Security Council approval. They intervened to stop a massacre. So sometimes in life, if you actually want to do the right thing, you can pretend to invoke, to virtue signal and say, I need the UN Security Council. What you're really saying, that's using fancy talk for saying Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping get the veto. And I won't take any action to stop mass murder of tens of thousands of people in 2 days. I don't like making comparisons to World War II, but Babi Yar, tens of thousands of people were killed in a similar kind of space. And to say that I won't do anything unless Putin and Xi Jinping says I can, that's the most immoral thing in the world, you could say. How shameful that our leaders of many Western countries are hiding behind this pretense as if they care about virtue, when the opposite is true. The virtuous people are those who lay down their lives, who are sacrificing their lives, Israeli and American pilots and servicemen and women, to fight an evil regime. These are the people who should deserve a Nobel Peace Prize, not some European sitting comfortably in London or Paris as saying, I need to ask the UN Security Council.
Yeah, it's a strange perspective, isn't it? And I think Starmer's reluctance was that he didn't see anything under international law that would allow the UK to take part in this. That's now changed.
Not sure if he did. Iran has been engaged in different levels of war against Americans and Israelis for many years. I don't know how many Americans they killed in Iraq with the roadside bombs. Terrorism, they tried to kill my friend in New York, Masih Alinejad, hired hitmen to try to assassinate my friend. They hired hitmen to try to assassinate President Trump and other U.S. officials. Iran has been engaged in war against Israel and America for years. So I'm sure if Keir Starmer would have made a teeny bit of an effort, I'm sure he could have found a good legal argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think my wider point there, though, was that Starmer's made that case. And I think the implication is that if British servicemen then went and it was an illegal war, he would then be forced to effectively prosecute his own military for having taken part in an illegal war. That's the point I'm making, is that
You mean he trapped himself?
By putting this on a pedestal, our politicians in Europe particularly are turning themselves inside out and ending up in some absolutely ridiculous positions because they are placing international law essentially ahead of national interest. And I think that all does stem from the UN. Look at what we're doing with the Chagos Islands because of a UN ICJ advisory opinion on where it should be, rather than because we've been told that we have to give the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. So I think I'm really making the point, I suppose, that the UN does seem to spin countries into very, very counterproductive positions. And if people want to adhere to the UN Charter, then they're actually, in many cases, damaging their own national interest. And I was wondering if you think there's ever really a way around that, or is the UN essentially a talking shop that has voluntary buy-in, and actually, when it comes to the crunch, international law doesn't really stand up to reality?
The UN matters. It does influence world opinion, and intelligent countries need to understand when they can work with it and when the UN becomes something that is immoral. Every political body has moments when it's immoral. My organization, UN Watch, was founded by a great American named Morris Abram. He began his career as a civil rights attorney in the South, in America, in Georgia. He was a close supporter and advocate and attorney for Martin Luther King before he was well known. This is in the 1950s, before it was a popular movement. He was helping get him out of prison. And he fought a racist system in the South where the votes of black men and women were not counted the same way as the votes of white people. And that was the law of the land, and he fought it. And the problem at the UN is that, 51% of dictatorships of a UN body can pass a horrible resolution. They can appoint fake judges. The head of the International Court was the former Lebanese ambassador, someone who voted dozens of times, maybe 150 times against Israel when he was the Lebanese ambassador. He voted against resolutions on Iran. He voted against human rights. And the next day he was appointed a judge on the International Court. And this is someone who was taking instructions from Beirut at the time that it was fully controlled by Hezbollah. And then you have judges from China and Russia or taking their marching orders from Beijing and Moscow. So it's absurd. So to say that you're going to, again, defer your moral judgment to a body that is obviously politicized, well, again, Morris Abram didn't do that when the state of Georgia passed racist laws. He said these things are immoral. And there are times when if a political body does something that's immoral, and if there's no way to challenge it, right, there is no appeals court of a decent appeals court that's actually going to apply justice and morality to UN decisions. There is no appeal. These are political bodies, and including the ICJ, which acts as a political body in most cases. Maybe a handful of Western judges who are honorable people, and even though they typically also vote similar to their countries, but the majority of them are not that way. So if you're going to say that you're going to pass on your moral agency and say, well, it has to be a UN body. If Moscow and Beijing doesn't allow it, the UN, then that's a shameful thing. So try to work with the UN if you can. It's great if you can get a majority. In some cases you can. On Russia and Ukraine, they were able to get 75 countries or more to vote with Ukraine. Russia got about 25, and a whole bunch of them abstain. And that's great. You can sometimes do that at the UN. Where you can't, that should not be a veto if you have to take moral action to save, in this case, millions of people of Iran, begging the world, we're being murdered, we're being shot in hospital beds. Help us.
Yeah, it feels to me, to cite that immortal line that Antonio Guterres came out with after October the 7th, which you echoed earlier. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't happen in a vacuum. That woeful piece of apology for Hamas. He was unable to see that Israel's response to October the 7th didn't happen in a vacuum. That happened as a result of October the 7th, and the UN seemed to edit out the initial atrocity and condemning Israel as if it was simply a genocide that it chose to embark upon and just is trying to wipe all the Palestinians out. And this sort of stuff, it feels to me as if the UN itself didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't arrive at this position where it's clearly biased against Israel, clearly biased against America, clearly biased against the West out of nowhere. It's been the result of many, many decades of history, infiltration by Soviet Union propaganda, manipulation by authoritarian regimes. It's almost like a microcosm of what's going on in many of our own societies, where we're trying to be good guys, we're trying to be open-minded and uphold the principles of an open society, and we're being exploited by people who wish to bring us down from within. Can you talk a little bit about the build-up, how we got to this deplorable situation with the UN?
It's been a long process, and certainly I would say it began in the 1960s with decolonisation, where you had a large majority of countries joining the UN who were not democracies, but dictatorships. Many of them were anti-colonial in their sentiment. And the Soviet Union at the time very cleverly manipulated them, built the so-called non-aligned movement, which was really, in many cases, an anti-Western movement. America was harder to take on frontally, but they could attack Israel as a proxy. So you had the hijacking of UN bodies since at least starting in the early 60s, but then ramping up in the late 60s, certainly after the 1967 war. That was seen as an opportunity for them to portray Israel as the aggressor. And it hasn't let up since. Infamously, that came to its zenith, or its nadir, if you will, in 1975, when the UN General Assembly adopted the infamous canard that Zionism is racism. And, that was the low point of the UN. Thankfully, that was repealed in 1991, only with the fall of the Soviet Union. That's not accidental. But we've seen it being revived. Certainly the focus on Israel. We had the Durban Conference of 2001. We're now marking 25 years of that conference, which was you could say, the first display in the 21st century of this new global anti-Semitism on the world stage. We had a forerunner of what we're seeing today. It was at that event, at the NGO Forum, where Israel was accused of apartheid and genocide, things that seemed ridiculous and absurd and defamatory and anti-Semitic, and were called out as such by decent people at that time. But that over time, they managed to press that throughout society, and today it's been embraced, promoted by the likes of the UN, and promoted, it should be said, outside the UN by groups like Amnesty International, which play a very nefarious role. And the piece I'll mention about the UN is that, everything I'm describing now is the member states, 56 Islamic states, dictatorships like Cuba, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, taking over UN bodies. But the truth is there's also a role of the UN Secretariat. Those are the employees. And I think that over time, anyone who was decent was kind of pushed out of the system. And so where we are today with the Secretariat is not the same Secretariat that would have existed in the 70s, maybe even in the 80s, even, and I joined here in 2004. There were always a few decent people, and there may still be a few today, but it's much less. I think that over time a culture was created that just the employees, those who are interpreting and implementing the resolutions, many of them, if you do have an approach that is not anti-Western, not anti-Israel, then you're kind of made to feel unwanted. You're either pushed out, you're either excluded, or you get the message that this won't be a comfortable job for you. So those are some of the factors at play.
Yeah, so we've spoken about the ICJ, how it's a politicized court. We've spoken about the Security Council and how Russia and China get a veto on there, which makes it incredibly hard to get anything done. You've just mentioned the Secretariat, the civil service, effectively. And I think it might be useful for viewers if you just talk about the two other things that I think have jumped out over the last 2 years, certainly. The first is the special rapporteurs. If we could maybe clarify what their roles are and what they do, because they carry a huge amount of weight. And yet, even in the last week, we've seen Albanese retweeting fake photos of accusing Israel of bombing a school. I think there was one rapporteur, if I remember rightly, who referred to the Epstein regime talking about Israel. This is clearly far outside the bounds of normal discourse. So who are these rapporteurs? What do they do? And what powers do they have? And why are they so high profile?
So I think you're right. They do have a certain influence, and it is a very peculiar mechanism that needs more attention. And we have a report coming out, hopefully next month, which will turn some needed spotlight on this bizarre mechanism. So the Human Rights Council is a body of 47 countries. They have terms for 3 years, and that's the Human Rights Council, a 47-nation body. That political body, made up of governments, can appoint experts. They are unpaid, but they have a lot of influence and prestige because they're called a UN human rights expert. These are the special rapporteurs. Their job is to report and monitor on human rights situations, both thematic on certain themes and on certain countries. So themes, there might be about, maybe 35 mandates to cover different themes. Some of them are good themes like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, racism, arbitrary detention, to speak out against these abuses. And in principle, the mandate itself in these instances are welcome and noble mandates. Then you'll also have thematic mandates that were never intended to be noble. There's a mandate on unilateral coercive measures, which is UN speak for Western sanctions. The dictatorships, Cuba, Iran, and others, created a resolution and a mandate, a special rapporteur who will condemn, as her job, condemn all Western sanctions as a violation of international law and a violation of human rights law and so forth. And the person who holds the job, again, it's unpaid, but is a Belarus academic. So she works for the state-sponsored regime university, and she's a shameless propagandist. She's had the job for, 4 or 5 years, 6 years actually, and she has flown, she has made official UN visits to Damascus under Assad, Iran under Khamenei, Venezuela under Maduro, Zimbabwe, I think still under Mugabe, but maybe probably his successor. She's gone to Russia. She's gone to China. And in each of these regimes that she went to, she said the regimes were the victims. The regimes are the victims of Western sanctions. So that's an example of a special rapporteur on a theme, and the whole theme is itself morally corrupt. So then you also have about 15 rapporteurs that deal with country situations. There is a rapporteur on North Korea, which is fine idea. There's a rapporteur on Belarus, and there's a rapporteur on Palestine. So these are the rapporteurs. They're unpaid. Now, the trick here, the rapporteurs, is that there's basically no accountability, right? Most UN officials that you hear about, for example, the UN Human Rights Chief or some agency director or deputy director, if you see something horrible that they've done, in theory, you can go to the Secretary General and say, what's going on here? Why did this woman who works for UN Women, named Sarah Douglas, why did she tweet 170 times in support of Hamas? And then the UN spokesman says, well, that does sound problematic and we're investigating and so forth. So you can get some accountability, you can get some scrutiny, quite rarely disciplinary action, but in principle, there is some accountability, in theory. The rapporteurs is different. The rapporteurs do not answer to the Secretary General. They answer to the Human Rights Council, which is to the 47 nations, many of which are dictatorships. And even those that are democracies like France or Germany or the Netherlands, they're not really interested in disciplining the rapporteurs. It's, in general, they'd rather defend the system. So the bottom line is, it's a system where there's no accountability, which is very rare in the world. If you pick an American Supreme Court judge, if he or she does something horrible, they can be impeached. And, it doesn't happen very often, but a judge can be impeached. Everyone typically has some accountability in a system. These rapporteurs basically have zero accountability. And so then you get an extreme case. Francesca Albanese, but also others, there's maybe a dozen others, very extreme, you mentioned one, this woman from South Africa, Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng. She's a nutcase. And I'm biased because she called me an evil scum white man. So yes, I'm biased, but she said bad words that I can't use on a podcast. And she was condemned by the South Africa health authorities. She was fined by them, I think 10,000 South African or rand. I don't know what the currency is today. But there's basically no accountability. So it's a very strange system. and it deserves more attention. The other thing, final thing I'll say about them is they're not funded themselves, but they seek funding. Governments can fund them, or foundations can fund them. So George Soros's Open Society Institute is funding some of these rapporteurs. China was giving $150,000 to this nutcase in Sydney, Australia, named Ben Saul, who attacks America and Israel every single day. Qatar was giving money to this rapporteur on sanctions. It's a very bizarre system.
Well, I just thought that one other area that might be worth addressing was, the genocide charges against Israel. Clearly going through the court case in the ICJ now, no decision yet made. But there was a report, wasn't there, that came out of the UN during the war that said that they considered it to be a genocide in Gaza. And I think this has done a lot of damage. It's cited very regularly by Israel's opponents. And of course, one of the writers was Navi Pillay, who has been regularly condemned for anti-Semitism. Could you just explain for our viewers where that came from and why it's not the UN official position and what it might be instead?
Well, certainly the UN Security Council never made that determination. That's important to note. And that's in part because the United States, the UK and France are on it. And so the UN Security Council never made that determination. It is true that various of these UN mechanisms have done so. The Human Rights Council has two mechanisms. One is this rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese. She's been saying that since the beginning. In fact, she's been accusing Israel of genocide for many years. I think there's a tweet of hers from 10 years ago, long before the Gaza war, where the Gaza-Israel war, it was Gaza that attacked Israel. Let's be sure about that. She's been accusing of Israel genocide. She says since its birth, it's been what's the term she used? Incremental genocide, something like that. So this kind of language is something that she's been trying to make stick on Israel, but just didn't really stick. The moment there were tragically thousands of dead bodies because of the war launched by Hamas, she was able to make it stick. But it's something that she and others, I mentioned the Durban NGO Forum, they tried that as well. So yes, it's true. Albanese said it. Yes, the Commission of Inquiry that was headed by Navi Pillay has said the same. If one looks at their analyses, you see that they're flimsy and really fall apart. They prove no intent. The only way that they are able to even make their arguments is by claiming that there's a new definition of intent, that you can infer it in all kinds of weird ways. And we just saw what Israel did in Iran. How in the space of a day or two they removed hundreds of major targets and dozens of leading officials. We saw the amazing power of Israel's Air Force. Obviously, if they wanted to kill tens of thousands of civilians, they could have done it in the space of a few hours, and that's not what happened. Israeli soldiers were killed and wounded by going into tunnels to fight hand to hand with the Hamas terrorists. So the thing is absurd, but it's just used as a modern form of the ancient blood libel to demonize the Jewish state and its supporters.
Now, when you've been going through these examples, I mean, it's the devil's in the detail. It's just so jaw-dropping that there could be such corruption, and that's what it is. It's corruption, ideological corruption at the UN, which has got this huge halo effect. I mean, one of the things that I've tended to say to people in the context of anti-Semitism is that they've got an advantage and we've got an advantage. Their advantage is the numbers, but our advantage is that we happen to be right. And that brings to mind your famous video from 2017, where you, after numerous Arab countries and others, all of which had terrible human rights records, had lambasted Israel, accusing Israel of apartheid. You went through one by one and said, Egypt, where are your Jews? Algeria, where are your Jews? Morocco, where are your Jews? And it seemed to stun them into silence.
Mr. President, let me begin by putting the following on the record. Everything we just heard from the world's worst abusers of human rights, of women's rights, of freedom of religion, of the press, of assembly, of speech, is absolutely false and indeed Orwellian. Today's report does not consider Israelis to be deserving of human rights, consistent with the approach of this Council, where today's notorious agenda item against Israel completely ignores their human rights. Now, over the weekend, President Abbas announced he was giving his highest medal to Rima Khalaf, who resigned from the Economic Commission of Western Asia, a Beirut-based UN agency of 18 Arab states, after Secretary General Guterres rightly instructed her to remove an absurd report which accused Israel of, quote, apartheid. Mr. President, why is Mr. Abbas celebrating a report written by the notorious Richard Falk after his own Palestinian mission here tried in 2010 to remove Mr. Falk on the basis that he was, quote, a partisan of Hamas, as we know from WikiLeaks? Israel's 1.5 million Arabs, whatever challenges they face, enjoy full rights to vote and to be elected in the Knesset. They work as doctors and lawyers. They serve on the Supreme Court. Now, I'd like to ask the members of that commissioned that report, the Arab states from which we just heard, Egypt, Iraq, and the others, how many Jews live in your countries? How many Jews lived in Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco? Once upon a time, the Middle East was full of Jews. Algeria had 140,000 Jews. Algeria, where are your Jews? Egypt used to have 75,000 Jews. Where are your Jews? Syria, you had tens of thousands of Jews. Where are your Jews? Iraq, you had over 135,000 Jews. Where are your Jews? Mr. President, where is the real apartheid? Why is there a UN commission on the Middle East that does not include Israel? From the 1960s and the 70s, they refused to include Israel. Where is the apartheid, Mr. President? Mr. President, why are we meeting today on an agenda item singling out only one state, the Jewish state, for targeting? Where is the apartheid, Mr. President?
And that's been viewed more than 11 million times since. Is that an effect that was a one-off? Do you sometimes feel that your position, which is clearly the right and moral one, and backed by the facts, by the way, as well, do you feel that sometimes you win just by shaming people into coming face-to-face with their own hypocrisy?
Well, look, at the UN, it's very hard to win, quote-unquote win, certainly because there's an automatic majority that will support any evil resolution that's supporting terrorism or attacking Israel. Famously, Abba Eban, the great orator of the 20th century and Israel's first ambassador and a former foreign minister, he famously made the quip that were Algeria to introduce a resolution at the United Nations condemning Israel, declaring that the earth is flat, and determining that Israel is the one responsible, it would pass by 164 to 12 with 8 abstentions. So, sadly, that remains true. There is an automatic majority. It's very hard to win. So really a profound question that faces anyone who's decent-minded and is trying to make a difference at the UN is what can you accomplish? And it's not obvious. If you're an American ambassador, if you're an Israeli ambassador, if you're a democracy who's one of the few who are trying to stand up and do the right thing, how do you win? It's very hard. In many cases, you're in an arena where the votes are fixed in advance, and the best thing you could do is try to make a stand for the truth, to show that, to go on record in history that you stood, you fought that battle, and you can use the UN. There's also an opportunity. It is the World Forum, and people regard things that are said and done there as having import. So if you take a stand for truth there, you can give strength to a young student from Vermont who told me in 2007, for a speech that I gave then, that the chairman banned the speech because, well, someone could say it's called the banned speech from March 2007. And a student from Vermont said he was on campus and he was he felt cornered by all kinds of prejudicial assaults on Jews and Israel. And he saw my speech, and somehow it gave him strength and encouragement and purpose, and somehow inspired him. And in many cases, I do believe that the things we do at the UN, even though we might lose, it can give inspiration to decent people around the world to see that someone fought for the truth and that they too can hold strong. Again, we're obviously trying to make a difference. We're trying to get evil people removed and fired. We're trying to educate people. We're trying to win. But some cases, if you take a stand and do it at the world stage, that can have consequences.
And how does the UN tolerate you? If you've been enjoying the conversation so far, don't panic. To catch the rest of the episode, just head over to our Substack at thebrinkpodcast.co.uk.